welcome back to the Real Zero podcast with me, Daniel Grant.
And me, Hugh Montgomery.
Hugh, how you been?
Not so bad. Stressing ever more about climate, but that's a perennial or continuous issue, isn't it? The data get worse every week, but still fighting the good fight. What about you?
Yeah, much the same. Again, when we were recording this, we have a very volatile president who's just got in, so things are changing every week. And, there's a lot of things which are changing, which we don't even talk about. On the mainstream media, I would say things about, scientific research, a lot of the funding's being cut, a lot of the way that we can communicate important things like this, it's all just disappearing with the funding overnight. So,
yeah, half of the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration in America were fired only 2 weeks before this recording. This is just at the time when we need the data.
It is. I think the other thing that's going on at the moment, we've got a couple of wars going on in the world. And I was overhearing you talking to our guest outside earlier, who was talking about how war can make innovation step forward. And so I'm really excited to have our guest in today who will talk about that, but also many other things to do with climate. And Hugh, you two know each other. Do you want to introduce?
Well, we do. In fact, I'm going to let Lieutenant General Richard Nugee introduce himself, because I couldn't possibly do justice to it, and he'll probably want to be selective in the bits he tells you about that's specific for today. So over to you.
Hugh, thank you, and Dan, lovely to be here. So I am a career soldier. In the end, spent 42 years in the army, ending up as a lieutenant general, so head of people, and I got bored of the fact that defence was not paying any attention to climate change at all. In fact, I was told we were exempt climate change, which I thought was a very interesting comment. And the first time it was said to me, I didn't have a clear answer. The second time I said, so we're exempt from the world, are we? So I wrote a report for the Ministry of Defence. It went to the Prime Minister, who was Boris Johnson at the time. I understand either quoted or used it as an extract when he was the President of the UN Security Council, talking about climate and security and the fact that they are inextricably linked. And that there is a job to do for militaries around the world, as well as an understanding of what the security implications are from climate change.
Well, it's terrific, because, as you know, I chair the Lancet, or co-chair the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change, and I no longer really believe that it's going to be health, quotes, impact. It's not going to be Zika, dengue, salmonella, malaria that's going to get us on heat waves. It's going to be the social collapse that will come from it, and that's something you're an expert in. So perhaps you could talk us through, firstly, I'm going to ask you that question. If we've got social collapse coming, which I believe we do, A, do you believe that? And secondly, how long do you think it is, if we continue as we are now, before we start seeing evidence of that societal collapse? And when does it become critical to us, do you think?
Well, so first of all, Is societal collapse inevitable? I think the answer to that is no, it's not inevitable, but it is very likely at the moment, and I think we're beginning to see that already. And I would argue that I've looked really closely at what is it that this country, the UK, will really care about as far as climate change is concerned, because the ICCP sixth report basically said Northern Europe's about the best place in the world to live in climate change, and so we're not seeing the effects that the rest of the world are seeing in the same way that the rest of the world is seeing it. And so we're, in a sense, we're cocooned. And so why should people in the UK care particularly? And I've been looking at that from a national security perspective. And I would argue there's sort of 5 areas. There's energy security. Well, people are slowly getting hold of that, but it's mostly because of the Ukrainian war. The second is water security. There's huge implications for water around the world as a result of climate change. The third is food security. The fourth is what I would call personal security, which is health, the sort of stuff you were talking about. Yeah. I actually don't think that's the major impact. And the fifth is migration, or border security.
Yeah.
There's a half, which is geoengineering. Geoengineering hasn't been weaponized, which is why it's only a half. All the others have been weaponized by various malign actors. And so what you're seeing is all of those have the potential to play out, but we're a very wealthy country in a very protected area, as it happens as a sort of freak of geography. And so none of those are going to affect us except one. And that one, I would argue, is migration. And For me, what you're already beginning to see is you're beginning to see the impact of parts of the world where you cannot live. It's not that you don't want to live there. You really would like to live there, but you cannot live there because you can no longer make a living there. You can no longer grow your crops. You can no longer feed your animals because all your animals are dead because it's too hot. And that environment means you have to move. And this, I think, is the really interesting thing. If you ask the UN, refugees, how many stay in the region and how many move out of the region, the answer, historically, and the extraordinary thing about climate change is it's ripping up all the history books regularly. If you look at the history books will say, and the UN will quote, 10% leave the region. The reality is that if you are fleeing because of climate change, there's no point in staying in the region because the region itself is damaged. Right. It's not just your village is damaged by conflict, yet the whole region is damaged. And therefore, the figure is closer to 20 to 25%. Now, if you talk about, the UN talks about 1 billion displaced people as a result of climate change by 2050, and we're already beginning to see this, then 20 to 25% is 200 to 250 million people moving out of the region.
Right.
So the 1 million that came from Syria, and that's a very well-known story, and it's being stoked by, Russia's doing its utmost to try and persuade people that migration is a thing which we should all be very, very worried about. That 1 million from Syria arguably had an effect on Brexit, as we sort of already come across. But talk about 200, 250 million. That's a game changer. And what you're beginning to see, and I think this is where climate change and security really the rubber hits the road. What you're beginning to see is government and people being frightened by this and starting to move to more radical politics. And so you're seeing the degradation of democracy as a direct result of climate change and the threat of climate change in a way that is utterly insidious to democratic institutions.
I mean, but I think you're spot on, obviously, because, I mean, if we rehearse briefly for the listeners who don't know the story as well, when the Kazakh grain crop collapsed in 2010 from a heat wave, it became a net importer of grain, not a net exporter. Grain prices went up threefold from $160 to $360 a ton. Speculation on rice prices pushed up. That triggered the Arab Spring in 10 countries. It led to mass migration into the Syrian capital, destabilized the Syrian government, led to a civil war. Then people, as you say, moved to Europe, and then the consequences of a mass migration into Europe were known. And of course, the issue is, as you rightly point out, that if people are suffering under poor and their region is affected, they'll move wherever they can, as I would. And that, if we look, is into Europe. So if we're looking already last winter, reservoirs in Spain and Portugal were down to 16% of their normal volume in the middle of winter. As you start seeing southern Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula becoming uninhabitable, and northern Africa, where are those people going to go? They're going to move upwards to France, to Germany, and across to here. Can I ask you as well, what about the economic consequence of this? Because presumably these sort of geopolitical changes abroad will hit our cost of living, our cost of food. Surely we're going to be hit by that as well, are we not?
So let's just take food for example. I was trying to work out why we're a very wealthy country in Northern Europe, and therefore, yes, okay, we may end up paying a little bit more for our food, but will that matter? Ultimately, I mean, I remember I was brought up in the 1970s,
right,
as you were, Hugh, and food was 30% of the household disposable income was spent on food, and so we've been there before. Now, of course, that meant that we didn't go on expensive holidays because we couldn't afford expensive holidays, as well as the food. But food was a very, very large part of the household expenditure. So we've been there before. It wasn't particularly pleasant, but we have been there before and we survived. But it isn't like that this time round. And it isn't like that. It isn't just a ratcheting up of more expensive food. That will probably happen anyway, I would argue. It's the fact that, and I use this as it's a pathetic example, but it's an indicator example. 2 Januaries ago, so not this last January, but the January before that, Britain started to run out of tomatoes.
Right.
and you couldn't get tomatoes in the supermarkets. Why? Most of our tomatoes come from Spain. Spain had a heat wave, and therefore there weren't enough tomatoes for Spain's primary market, the EU, as well as their secondary market, this bit of the continent which is no longer part of the EU, which is the UK. So it wasn't that we couldn't afford to buy the tomatoes. They didn't want to sell to us because they had a primary market that they had to sell to, which was the EU. So what you're going to see, and it is a pathetically small example, you can't sort of put the whole of world food onto a set of tomatoes not appearing in Sainsbury's. But what that shows is that when food becomes more scarce, and there's two reasons for that. One reason is the destruction of soil, which I think is a really big issue for us. And that's because we've had 60 to 70 years of toxic fertilizers, which have produced an amazing yield growth. But if you look at the graphs now, that yield growth has stopped. We're flatlining despite putting tons and tons of fertilizer into the soil, which suggests that the soil is exhausted from all the fertilizer. So we're going to sort of flatten out on food, but there's also heat waves and heat domes which destroy some of the grain. And there's war. Let's not, this is not the only cause of trouble in the world. War in Ukraine has completely damaged the grain harvest from there as well. So it's not just climate change, but climate change is a major piece. When that food becomes scarce, it won't be necessarily who can afford the most. It's who do they want to sell to. Right. And it becomes, in a sense, it becomes a bargaining tool. It becomes a weapon. It becomes an ability to get trade deals. It becomes an ability to create allies. And so there is a very high chance that unless you play your cards really, really well, it's not just a question of buying food, which will be more expensive. It's a question of, have I got access to the markets? And that's where I think we will go. And I think that Britain doesn't have a terribly strong hand to play, as an example. Europe has a stronger hand to play, but Europe is going to suffer more food disaster than I think it realizes. And I would, if I may, just very briefly, that's because of the Mediterranean. And I think this is something that really hasn't been understood at all. The Mediterranean was created when Africa hit Europe. Everybody knows that. And it was a salt lake, and now it's a sea, but it's a sea with a tiny bottleneck. At Gibraltar. That sea is heating up somewhere between 20 and 50% faster than every other ocean in the world because it has a little bottleneck, because it is effectively an inland lake. That sea, though, for the last 5,000 to 6,000 years, where civilization has come from, has provided a stabilizing influence, an absolutely solid temperature for the whole of Europe, because it has stayed, broadly speaking, the same temperature the whole time. That is changing. And that solid, stable temperature, and I was chatting to somebody who studies this from Spain, and he's really worried because actually that solid, stable temperature is going. It's having an effect on fish. Yeah, okay, forget that. It's having a massive effect on the agriculture of Europe, because that stable temperature is what provides the ground, if you like, the ground foundations for successful agriculture in Europe.
Yeah, and of course, I'm making some notes as you're talking there. Of course, the economic hits from extreme weather events, particularly on crop production. In the US, we saw the data only a couple of weeks back now. The US having lost nearly $1 trillion last year alone, 800 billion. EU's conservative estimate mainly on crop hits was 50 billion last year. And in terms of stable weather, of course, the Atlantic Ridge will overturn circulation. There's a paper actually last week in Nature saying it might not completely collapse, but it's definitely going to slow dramatically, and probably within 20 to 30 years. So yet again, it's not just going to be the inland lake of the Mediterranean. It's going to be the heat dragged up from the Pacific past our western shores in Britain that's going to be disrupted. And of course, as you point out, the same time with the northern jet stream oscillating, the rain isn't falling in Spain and Portugal, and it's dumping on Great Britain, which rather knackers our root crops in the winter.
Well, there's a couple of things there. I find this absolutely fascinating. I gave a talk to the NATO maritime experimental center where they look at all these things, and it was the first major talk on climate change they had, and they had a 3-day symposium where I was one of the keynote speakers. In fact, I sort of summed up the whole thing, and one of the speakers early on in the 3 days was an AMOC scientist, the Atlantic Marine Overtake Circulation scientist. And I said, look, I don't really understand this. Can you explain what's happening and why? And he explained that it's the hot water coming from the equator, comes up to the Arctic, actually goes down to the Antarctic as well, and then gets cooled down, and then goes down the eastern seaboard of America, cold, so they get really cold temperatures, and we get really warm temperatures because we got all the hot water coming up our way, and that's called the Gulf Stream. That's great for France, Spain, and Britain, particularly, and Ireland. With that slowing down, what he said, what will happen is that what you'll end up with is a really, really cold winter. And he said, I don't know whether you remember him. I said, no, I'm afraid I wasn't born. You might be, Hugh. The winter of 62, 63 was the coldest winter, where they were using those sort of drills that they used to drill roads with, pneumatic drills, to get potatoes out of the ground because the ground was so solid. But the other thing he said, which I thought was absolutely fascinating, is I said, why is it that we've got drought and flood? What's happening in the climate change world that is making this drought and flood? And he said, it's really, really straightforward. This is he was sort of, I mean, he was Italian, and it was all over the place, and it was wonderful. But he turned around and said, it's a really simple formula that was found in the 19th century.
Yes.
For every degree of heating that the ocean goes through, you get 2% more evaporation. For every degree that the atmosphere increases, you get 7% more chance, more ability to hold that water. So when it does rain, it rains 3.5 times heavier, and the time between rains is 3.5 times longer. It's really simple.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that time and time and time again.
Absolutely right. And of course, for the physicists who for GCSE or whatever, it's that latent heat of evaporation, isn't it? All that heat in the oceans. And remember, 92%, as you well know, of the energy that we're gaining in our atmosphere is being gained by the oceans. That's used to evaporate the water. But when that water condenses and comes back as rain, that energy gets released. And it gets released. That's what's driving, of course, these extreme storm events. Can I come back to you? Because I made a note at the time. You listed 5 things: energy security, water, food, health, migration, and of course, encompassing it, economics and war. You said that they've all been weaponized.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could help explain that to our audience. In what way are these climate change-driven events being used by other people?
So it's very, very briefly, because I could spend hours talking about this. Energy has very and I'll take specific examples in specific parts of the world, but take energy. Energy has definitely been weaponized by Putin. Putin allowed Europe to become utterly dependent on gas and oil, and then just shut us off. And so we scrabbled around all over the place for different sources of energy, which ultimately led to huge price hikes. We all know that, but also made it much more difficult for us to wean, it became very difficult, particularly for Germany, to wean itself off Russian energy, and that compromised their position on the Ukraine war. So it was a very deliberate attempt to try and compromise Germany, particularly, but Germany's position on the Ukraine war. And it's no coincidence the way they've done that. What does it also offer? Actually, it offers opportunity for us to become energy independent if we go for renewables. But that's a separate debate. If you look at food, the way that food is weaponized, take an African example. Food is weaponized by various non-state actors, malign actors, using food as a way of buying votes in very, very simple terms. And so it's fascinating that the coup in Niger, I think it was 2 years ago now, it was described by African scientists and African commentators, not Europeans, as the first climate change coup in the world. And the reason they said that is because actually what had happened is that the grain and the harvests had failed, and there'd been floods, And so the non-state actors who were desperate to get rid of the government were using the food in order to buy votes, in order to try and destabilize the government. So it had been weaponized by them to try and make sure that the government that they didn't like toppled, which is exactly what happened in that coup.
Now, this is interesting because, of course, it leads us down this rabbit hole of social media and malign actors using the web to spread false information. But is there an opportunity then for state actors particularly to weaponize the messaging? I'm thinking, for instance, Los Angeles fires. Clearly, climate change driven event, right? A desiccation of the soil, 3 centimeters of rainfall in a year, and then strong hot winds driven down. So when the fire started, whether or not that was deliberate, the flames were found and Los Angeles burned. But the narrative wasn't, oh my word, this is a climate change event. It was immediately pivoted to the sexual orientation of the fire chief or the colour of the skin of the helicopter pilots. Is that just random or is that cynical, do you think? Or is there potential for that sort of intervention to be cynically used?
I don't know about that particular circumstance, but it wouldn't surprise me if malign actors would use and jump on anything that they possibly can in social media to try and. I mean, I find the concept of influencers who are very outspoken about misogynism or things like that, I find it really repellent, but they have a huge influence. I mean, they are influencers and they have a huge influence. And so it is too easy to be used in a sort of disinformation way to by people who want to destabilize. And I think this is I go back to, for me, the really insidious piece about climate change is it destabilizes governments, it destabilizes democracies, and people who have a vested interest in destabilizing. And let's call it out. Russia has made it quite clear they do not like the Western democracy of Europe and America to an extent. They don't like that, and they want to see the end of that sort of Western hegemony that they see as a threat. They will go out of their way, and the number of times I've been told that the number of cyber attacks that Russia is making on this country and on other countries in Europe every day is extraordinary. And so why wouldn't they use that? Why wouldn't they use every aspect that they can to try and destabilize, to try and make the government look weak, to try and make them look ineffective, and to use actors who are either complicit or naive to spread their stories?
Well, that's right. Was it the helpful idiot? Is it
and I don't say anybody is a helpful idiot because I don't know enough. They may be completely complicit, but there are people who are going out there who are deliberately trying to undermine the government. Usually, actually, if you look at it really, really basically for their own advantage.
And we could go back to the Arab Spring, the Kazakh grain crop example, but of course that was before the days of social media being big. That was when basically you and I could go to a supermarket, they'd absorb the cost. We still bought bread because they wanted us in to buy toilet cleaner, DVDs and red wine. If you're in a poor country, you couldn't feed your family. And the blame didn't go on climate change. The blame went on your government. Are we seeing examples of that now? Are there any parts of the geography of the world where you could point to go, do you know what? I think the climate is changing there and there is causing destabilization, but the climate's not getting the blame.
Oh, I think there's a really good example. We've been a group in Oxford that I'm part of have been working in Jordan at the behest of the king, and I really take my hat off to the foresight of the Jordanians in this aspect. So there they've got an example. They have had some of the worst droughts that they've ever experienced. They get floods in Petra last year. I think it was last year, might have been the year before, which caused enormous damage to their tourism industry. They have a real problem because actually they desperately need water, but at the same time they are very short of water, and yet tourism is such a large part of their economy. So what you have is farmers, because there are, and in the eastern side of Jordan, there's a lot of farmers having to go down to the aquifers and draining the aquifers in order to provide the water, the subterranean aquifers, in order to provide the water to be able to farm. That is limited. What's the net effect of that is those farms are beginning to collapse. So they're moving into the cities. The cities, if you take, and it's not the case in Jordan, but you take the unemployment rate in Africa, the African Bank turned around and said that under the age of 30, the unemployment rate in Africa generally is about 30%. So you take people who are coming from the rural environment into cities. First of all, you're getting rural crime, people nicking cattle, and sort of cattle rustling. But you take those farmers who can't make money anymore, and my goodness, it's a scratchy existence anyway compared to what we're used to, and they move into the cities. There is no job. There are no jobs. And what do? Ultimately, they turn to crime. Now, what you're beginning to see is increased crime in the cities in Jordan, which is an incredibly safe country in the Middle East, and compared to every other country around it, just about, not quite, but almost. There's the beginnings of crime waves. More insidiously is, and of course that's not blamed on climate change, but actually the climate change is the driver. Yeah. Is the driver. But then you look at water now. In order to make the tourism work, they need water for swimming pools, because the tourists come and they want swimming pools. So there's water that is patently, obviously there, which are in swimming pools, and yet you've got parts of the country where water is really scarce. They're one of the poorest, or they're one of the water poorest parts of the world for populations. And instead of saying, this is the problem of climate change, there's been no rain for 2 years of any sort, they're turning around and saying, well, it's the king, it's the government who are to blame. They're hoarding all the water. And so what you're beginning to get, and again, they're not blaming climate change, but you're beginning to get this impact on destabilizing a government that is doing the very best it possibly can for its people, and yet can't operate in an environment where there is no rain, except build massive, and they are building a huge desalination plant and pushing water upstream, but it's very expensive.
So, I mean, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole of geology of aquifers, but you and I know that aquifers come in different flavors, as it were. The fossil aquifers have got water that's been held there for millions of years, sometimes tens of millions. And once you run dry, they never, ever refill, at least not in geological timescales. That's already happened, of course, in many states in that area, that they depended on that for agriculture. The fossil reservoirs went dry, and that was the end of their agriculture. And these fossil reservoirs too, in other words, is it recoverable? Is Jordan now drained its fossil aquifers and it won't ever go back to having the agriculture it once had, or is it fixable?
Some of it is fixable, but it requires rainfall, and there isn't any.
Yeah.
And it's not as if you could sort of pump water down into the aquifers. So it's more a question, I think, of it is a very serious problem for them, and they're very, very aware of this. I mean, they are. I've been immensely impressed by the amount of data that the Jordanians have captured in their country. It's just, what do you do with that data once you've got it? So they know that the aquifers are draining very, very fast. They know that the water is running out, which is why they're building this massive desalination plant. But that won't be enough. They need rain, or they need more water from the Jordan River. The irony is that the Jordan, if no water was taken out of the Jordan River from its birth to Jordan itself, Jordan would have plenty of water, but actually the vast majority is taken out by Syria, by Israel, and so on as it goes down the line, and that's inevitable. Every country takes a bit, and that actually goes on to the weaponization point. You know, there is a upstream downstream tension on rivers that are failing to deliver now. And there's a really, really good example of this, which is the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, where they've built a huge dam, and it has a huge lake behind it, or will have a huge lake behind it, the reservoir, and it'll provide a third of Ethiopia's energy from water turbines. Outstanding. Brilliant idea. Well done. Lots and lots of money to go and do that. They've gone down the Nile, and the Blue Nile. And Egypt is absolutely 100% reliant on the Nile for its water. And so by damming the Nile, the Egyptians now, and it's a long time since the sort of the inundation which the ancient Egyptian civilization relied on. It's a long time since that was a feature because they're controlled by dams upstream. But now Egypt has a very definite person or country to blame if there isn't enough water. And there's a huge debate going on about how quickly they fill that lake. The dam is nearly finished. And if not just about finished, do they take the Ethiopian route, which is absolutely minimize the amount of water going down the Nile, brackets, that's a disaster for Sudan, and it's, although slightly less for Sudan because they've got the White Nile as well, and a disaster for Egypt? Or do they take what the Egyptians want, which is 15 years, so 5 times longer, to fill the lake, which allows sufficient water to go down the Nile? So you've got an immediate tension. If it takes 15 years, then the turbines are not as effective, and therefore they're not getting as much electricity, and therefore, et cetera, it's not as good for Ethiopia. But if they don't take 15 years and they take the 3 years that Ethiopia wants, you end up with Egypt turning around and saying, you are strangling my country. It's not just you're stopping the water, you're strangling my country. That is how water can be weaponized to deliver an outcome that you want.
And of course, we're going to see that with Himalayan meltwater, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, you're making me think back, of course, the collapse of the Egyptian civilization when, of course, the Egyptians had anchored themselves with agriculture for one of the first times, actually. They could put people in one place because they had a supply chain and could grow lots of crops. And when the water supply changed, suddenly there was no food. Okay, well, I'm going to draw things slightly to a conclusion, but I'm going to ask you, Dan, I mean, you've been sitting patiently as we shoot the breeze here, and I have to say I found that fascinating, and I could go on for hours asking Richard questions, but what's your take on this? What have you heard? Anything you want to challenge or question, or anything that you heard that's new? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, some people say I've got the easy job because all I sit back is listen, but actually it's quite difficult. And I think I speak for people who are listening to this at home because it's almost overwhelming hearing, you guys talk, the knowledge, the ramifications of everything you're talking about makes you think about it, makes you want to re-listen and go through things in a bit more detail. I mean, I think the two things that come to mind, I won't tell you my thoughts. I've got a question for you, Richard. And Hugh, this has also made me think that we should do a podcast about the health ramifications of some of this, massive migration, increased temperature, what's the burden of disease, that kind of stuff. Not for today, but I think we should do one.
Okay.
And Richard, you've mentioned a lot of stuff. So my question is, what's the way out? Is there a nice way out of this? Or do you see there has to be some kind of collapse? There has to be some kind of massive or something, to reset the balance? Or can we find a way out of this that's, a good way out?
So I'm an optimist. I suppose as a military person, you have to be an optimist. If you went onto a battlefield thinking you weren't going to come off it, you wouldn't go on it in the first place. So you have to be an optimist, and it's sort of drilled into us to always think of the optimist side. It's always going to happen to somebody else, sort of thing. And that's the optimism that is built into military people, most military people. And you don't survive long if you're not. So I am an optimist. What is the answer? There's no single answer to all of this. And I think what we have to realize is that we're going to go through difficult times because governments are going to be overwhelmed by the totality of stuff that isn't labeled climate change, but climate change is the root cause of an awful lot of it. And so we have to understand that the governments are going to have a very, very difficult time. We're going to have a less pleasant life, I think. And you're beginning to see that with, sparked by what's happening in America, a absolute insistence on increasing the amount of defense budget. Well, it wasn't a month before that the Chancellor was saying we don't have any money to do anything, and we're cutting polices all over the place, and yet now we're having to find money for defence. And that's a realism and something that I would support. It's realistic to put more into defence because what we want is deterrence rather than having to fight it out. If you end up fighting, it's unbelievably expensive. As opposed to 2.5% or 2.7% or 3%, 55% of GDP was what it took to win the Second World War. 55%. We've never done it with any form of welfare state in this country, and we must go out of our way to make sure that we don't get to that position. So providing a reasonable deterrent is a cheaper way of doing it than having to provide a country where there is no welfare state. So it's going to be more difficult. Let's just accept that. It's going to be more difficult, but it's not necessarily going to be a disaster. And I think there's a role for innovation. There's a role for some really clear-headed thinking as to what we can do and what we can't do. There's some really clear, it's called adaptation in the world of climate change, but actually it's just how can we prepare ourselves and make ourselves more resilient as a country, as a Western hegemony, as a sort of Western European piece. How can we make ourselves more resilient to both climate change, but also all those second and third order effects that come from climate change, but are never recognized as coming from climate change?
Right. So I'm going to, as I always do, sum up with what I think we should do in response. I mean, the first thing I think we would both agree on is we've got to stop emitting as much. Driving this process is nuts. And we don't have to reiterate the things that we know that we can all do as individuals, but, we can move our bank accounts. This week, in fact, the government banking service was announced to be binning Barclays because they are heavily funding fossil fuels. So you can move your bank account to a bank that doesn't. You can change your diet to be more plant-based. You can change your investments. You can fit your solar panels. You can buy your electricity from a 100% renewable supplier. You could try to fly less around the world and use your foot and your bicycles and so forth. And you can get other people to take action.
Yeah, Hugh, is there a good website people can go to check this out?
And amazingly, you could go to the realzero.earth website, which would tell you what to do there. The second thing I've learned today is the add-on for me, which is the think beyond the first order. So I'm going now, when I hear this government's terrible, Keir Starmer's awful, or so-and-so's awful because X has happened, I'm going to try to remind myself to think next order of question, Dan, why did that thing happen? Was that really their fault? Or was it something else that drove it, like climate change? But let me throw it back to you. We like our audience not to just want to slash their wrists at the end of a podcast. You've heard the general things we're suggesting. What would you want people to leave this podcast doing differently, approaching things differently, thinking differently, acting differently politically? Is there anything, or economically, what would you want us all to do? What's your recipe for us? Do you have one?
I could probably write a book of recipes and it wouldn't answer the question. So I think my answer is I often say look at things through a sustainability lens. Now, what do I mean by that? Occasionally, I run a little exercise with a business and say, okay, let's just say Just Stop Oil won today. There is no more oil in the world tomorrow. How is your business going to survive? How is your life going to survive without it? Let's do a thought experiment of trying to work out, and this is what I mean by look through a sustainability lens, look at what would the consequence be to your personal life, to your business or whatever, to your job, and then say there's no oil left. How am I going to survive? It's a thought experiment, because Just Stop Oil are not going to win. We're going to be using oil for longer than we need to and longer than we'd like to, but we're probably still going to be using oil for a while. But what have you learned from that thought experiment of how could I change both the way that my business operates and the way that my life operates that would be better in order to accommodate the fact that there's no oil? Well, there is oil, but actually, if you've thought through the consequences of there being no oil, you might have come up with, I think you will come up with, much, much, much better solutions, and then enact them, because they'll probably be better for your business and they'll certainly be better for your life.
Brilliant. So we can all map where we're using oil, directly or indirectly, and what we can do in our own lives to make those changes. Richard, that's fantastic. I think we'll call it a halt then. Thank you. That's been absolutely tremendous. Richard, thank you so much for your insights.
Well, thank you.
Time. I think we might have to get you back for round 2 because there's so much to discuss. And Dan, as always, a pleasure. I'll see you next time.
See you next time, Hugh. Take care. Great conversation, guys. See you later.
Thanks, Dan.
Bye-bye.
The Real Zero podcast with Hugh Montgomery and Daniel Grant. Produced by me, Daniel Grant, aka The Stealth Doctor, on YouTube and Instagram. Find out more about Real Zero by heading to realzero.earth and find out more about how you and your friends can start making a real difference today.